All right, everybody. Hello, this is Dr. Leslie Blevins with Enilda Clinic, and I am having another expert chat today. This one is super special. It is on dyslexia or a reading disorder, and I am here with Casey Harrison. She is down in Texas. What city are you in?
Little town outside of Austin, Texas.
Awesome. Awesome. I think Austin's known for music.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Cool. Okay. It was almost a 100% guess. I think I only knew it was known for music from The Office. Okay. Yeah. So Casey is incredibly specialized in dyslexia. She sent me some information on herself, and it's just tremendous. The information that she has, like all of her background. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. I did the math here, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems like you've been in education for over 25 years.
Yeah, I'm coming up on that. Yeah.
Wow, that is awesome. Okay, so she's been a teacher. She's won awards, Teacher of the Year in her school, a semifinalist in her district. She is licensed as a dyslexia specialist or dyslexia therapist, and she's certified as an academic language therapist. She has a certification as a structured literacy dyslexia specialist, and she is a licensed teacher, a qualified Texas teacher, which must be certification or a license. Okay, and a Hays County Best of winner in tutoring services. I mean, it's like a really long list, you guys. I'm only saying like a few things, but I just want you guys to know that she has so many accolades for the amazing work that she does, specifically in dyslexia. And I was just kind of reading through her website, and she has a quote on here from one of the principals that she's worked with. And the principal says that she's the most evidence-based teacher / tutor she's ever worked with. And that to me is the highest compliment someone could ever give someone in the kind of work we do. I just love it. Yeah. Hi everyone, I just want to interrupt real quick and ask you to subscribe to our learning newsletter. You can do so at enildaclinic.com, right on the right side where you're watching this video, or at YouTube by hitting the subscribe button. Okay, so Casey, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Will you just start by kind of telling us your story to get to where you are with all these licensures and certifications? What do they mean? What kind of skill set do you have to hold all these things?
Okay. So, as you said, I've been in education for a very long time. It was something I knew I had wanted to go into, and I taught ESL for a long time, and I just kind of wove my way into really falling in love with the reading part of how language develops into reading and working with kiddos. And so through that time, I ended up becoming a literacy specialist. And then I worked for district level writing curriculum. And throughout that whole time, we had never heard of dyslexia. And when I was writing curriculum for the district and working as a literacy facilitator for the district is when the National Reading Panel came out in the year 2000 that talked about all of the research behind best practices for helping our students achieve success in reading. And I mean, that's been 20 years ago. And that evidence still holds true. And so through that time, I read that thing back to back. And I realized that there was a lot of information that was new to me, even as being a district level literacy facilitator, because it wasn't really covered in undergraduate or graduate courses. And as I worked with children who were struggling, I realized that there was always these little kiddos who kind of fell through the cracks, where it what we were doing wasn't working. And so through my journey, I ended up seeking out specialized training with the Scottish Rite Hospital. And they do a very intensive 2-year training where you have to do 200 hours coursework, and then you have to do 700. When I went through, it was 720 clinical hours, and so it was really intense. And through that, I learned all of the evidence and the science behind reading and what's actually happening in our brains as readers, as neurotypical readers, and then also as the dyslexic brain. And what I actually do, we are actually rewiring neural pathways in the brain with the therapy that I do. And so, yeah, it's really cool. I love it.
One of the really interesting things that you said was even back in 2000, education programs weren't necessarily training teachers on the evidence-based strategies for teaching reading. And my master's and my doctorate theses or thesi, I don't know how you say the plural of those, they were both on reading. And so I did a lot of research around the National Reading Panel's recommendations. And specifically with my doctoral dissertation, I focused on supporting teachers with that. Even now, 20 years later, the vast majority of teaching programs do not teach and support teachers in using what's evidence-based to teach reading. It is astounding.
Yeah.
Astounding. So just kudos for you for really taking the recommendation of experts, the scientists who are studying our kids' brains, and doing that and taking it, and making your career built on that to really support children. That's wonderful. It just gives me chills. I want you to know I got chills right now. Okay. So, and that's interesting too. I'd never heard of Scottish Rite Hospital and their program. So that's something I'll look into later. Because I'm always looking for like the best programs and whatnot to just have as resources in my back pocket. I find with dyslexia specifically, there's like this grab bag of programs, and it's hard to figure out what is evidence-based and what isn't, because oftentimes there's a program that has evidence-based components and stuff that doesn't have evidence-based components. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? I know there's a lot of big name programs out there. What would happen if, let's just pretend I'm a parent calling you up and I'm saying my kid was just diagnosed with dyslexia. What are you going to say to me about what's the protocol for treatment and what happens?
Yeah. So what we know about the dyslexic brain is that it's actually a different processing system. And so when we think about reading, a lot of people feel that it just comes naturally, right? And this is kind of the philosophy that exists in the whole language world, right? If we immerse children in great literature and we get them excited about loving reading and we surround them with words and letters, that they're going to figure it out. And that's kind of thinking that reading comes naturally. But what we know through science, what we know through fMRIs that have been done on the brain is that everyone learns how to read the same way. We might learn at different paces, but there's actually science behind how we all learn to read. And when we're looking at the brain imaging of neurotypical children, we have these areas that fire up. And so we have our visual lobe, and we have our sound lobe that's working, and we have our thinking lobe, and they're all working together to come reading. But there's no area in our brain that's designated for reading, because our brains are designed for language, and our brains are designed for oral language and speaking, and reading is something that's fairly new, and so our brains don't have a set area that is designed for reading. And so we've created these pathways in our brain that connect these different areas in our brain to come up with reading. But what happens with our dyslexic kiddos is there are certain areas of the brain that aren't firing up as well as they need to in order to create these really fast pathways for them. And so that's why it's often slower. And so when I tell parents is that, you know, if they're looking for assistance in helping to get therapy or tutoring for their children, I do recommend that if you've been diagnosed with dyslexia, that you seek out a therapist. And so that's someone who has gone through extensive training and really understands the science behind how to work the brain so that we can unlock the code. And so some different things would be to look for a certified academic language therapist through altaread.org, or someone who is a fellow with, through the Orton-Gillingham program. And so we have these two different avenues, but both of those are like the highest level that you can reach as far as understanding it and having the training behind it. Some of the things that I sometimes see is people, you know, well, I went to a training for a week and then they offer tutoring, and I think that's great, but when we look at what our kids need who have been diagnosed, they really do need someone who has a deep understanding of the science of reading and how it works and what to do to help our kids unlock the code.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And those two resources you just named, I will reference those in the notes for this video. So wherever you're watching this video, look at the description to find links. Okay. And just to kind of, you know, summarize something that you just said, it sounds like our brains are having to create connections with sort of these basic processes of visualizing, talking, and then, you know, doing more analyzing information in order to actually form the ability to read, because there's no part of our brain that does reading just on its own. And so our kids with dyslexia are having maybe difficulties creating a speedy pathway to do that. So that's so interesting, because I know with the Orton-Gillingham programs, it's all about just practicing doing those strategies with like learning sounds and the writing the letters and the symbols, or I guess like the graphemes for the sounds and whatnot, over and over and over again. Lots and lots of repetition.
And that's something that we do, right? Because we have to overlearn, because we're actually creating these neural pathways. And so you can think of it as driving a car, right? So we can take the highway, which goes a lot quicker, but a lot of times for our dyslexic kiddos, they're on the country scenic route. And so they'll get there, but it's maybe not the quickest or most efficient way, so that each time they come across the word, they're having to sound it out. And so what we're doing by overlearning something is you're creating that pathway and extending it so that they can access it in a quicker way the next time that they see it.
Love it. Yeah, that's such a good analogy. I love that. Something I realized we haven't actually said yet is the definition of dyslexia.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I know I have mine as a school psychologist, but let's hear yours too.
Yeah, and so there is a definition that you can find on the International Dyslexia Association's page, and I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but basically what we're saying is that we have children who struggle with word fluency, word recognition, those decoding skills. They may or may not have trouble with fluency. Often is impacted. Comprehension then is that secondary factor that comes into play, and we'll see it in spelling. So we're having these difficulties, and one of the big things is that it's often unexpected. So these are kiddos who a lot of times when parents come and talk to me, they're like, I knew something was going on in kindergarten, but I was told, give them time, they'll figure it out, they're a boy, they just need more time. And that's something that we need to understand as educators and also as parents, is that our kiddos, dyslexia is lifelong, so more time isn't going to help. What we need to do is to provide interventions that are appropriate for helping them create these linkages in their brain. Mm-hmm. And when we wait, it actually can really become kind of harder. We can always remediate at any age, but you know, the brain when it's younger is a lot has a lot more plasticity, and so it's a little bit easier to close that gap a little bit quicker.
Yeah, for sure. So then talk to me a little bit more about ages, because I get a lot of parents who come in and they're wanting a reading disorder. So sometimes I'll say reading disorder, and they're within our DSM, which is our diagnostic manual. We have a specific reading disorder, which is a broad category, and then there's a subtype that is dyslexia. So
yeah.
Exactly what Casey was just saying, it's like the very foundational skills of reading. It's that phonological processing, it's manipulating the sounds, having fluency with the sounds so that you can read words quickly, just doing all the basic things really well and easily. And that would be dyslexia. But sometimes your kid might have a difficulty with comprehension and no difficulty at all with the basic skills of reading. That's not going to be dyslexia. That's going to be something different. And so where am I going with this? Okay, so ages. So sometimes I have parents come in and their kid is like 4 and they want a reading disorder diagnosis, and that's pretty hard for us to diagnose at 4 years old.
Yeah, I mean, you can diagnose at 5, 5.5, and get 92% accuracy in determining if you have characteristics or have dyslexia falling under the DSM, under that specific language disability. But one of the things that's important to note for dyslexia is that oftentimes it runs in families. And so we can look and see, you know, if both parents have dyslexia, then chances of that child also having dyslexia are pretty high. And what we can do is look for some of these indicators that often show up very, very early in their ages. So even in the preschool years, some of the things that our children might struggle with are having a hard time remembering nursery rhyme. They might have a difficult time remembering the names of the letters in the alphabet, and unable to even recognize letters that are in their own names can be really hard for kiddos that are struggling in those preschool years. And one of the big things that I think is important is that persistent baby talk. So when we have kiddos, and I know it's really cute as parents because I have a 3-year-old and she says adorable things, but when they're saying like Piscetti or, you know, that persistent baby talk, those are things where that's telling us that that phonology, that ability to hear sounds and manipulate sounds and sequence those sounds is off. And so those are some things that definitely show up as a deficit. That's like the primary deficit for our kiddos with dyslexia. So when we're looking at those red flags, that's often one of those things. So sometimes those kiddos who are in speech will often have a coexisting dyslexia disorder because they have some of those same difficulties with that phonological component.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's pretend I'm a parent. I've set up my kid with services for you. What will it look like?
So one of the things that we want to make sure is happening when we are doing our instruction is that it really needs to be explicit, meaning that we don't leave room for the children to discover or, to make guesses, right? That we are letting them know exactly how things work. Now, we will lead them through a discovery model, but it's always directly linked to the auditory processing, to the visual processing, and then to tactile. And so we have these very structured, explicit language. So the things that you want to look for if you're seeking therapy or tutoring, you want someone who understands that it needs to be explicit. It needs to be systematic, meaning that we're constantly linking old learning to new learning, and that we're continuing to have that cumulative review, because constantly pulling things up, linking them to new learning, so that we're creating those really strong neural pathways in the brain. It also needs to be diagnostic, meaning that we're using where the children are to understand how we maybe best need to scaffold information and lessons so that we're always moving forward. And so those are kind of those key components that I would look for. And you're going to have parents you know, you want teachers that are using the terms like structured literacy, so that they're looking at making sure that they're including these key components of phonology, which is talking about the ability to play with sounds, looking at sound symbol relationships. And so I think that this is where everyone gets kind of stuck, right? Like phonics. So that's really your phonics, but that's only one piece that we work on. And that's looking at that alphabetic code and understanding how we're linking the phonemes and the graphemes, or the sounds and the letters together, so that our kids can work with that. But we also work on syllables so that our kids can understand how to decode multisyllabic words. We work on morphology, which is talking about the smallest units of meaning, so that even with my kindergartners, when we look at adding, I teach them add suffix S means more than one. And so we'll look at a base word and we'll add a suffix. And that's helping them understand that those all carry meaning.
Right.
And then we also look at syntax and semantics. So it's really this very well-rounded idea that comes behind it. And that's really the science behind what goes on in our brain when we're learning how to read.
Yeah, and it's like you're breaking it down into this algorithm, right? It's like learning to read isn't this mysterious process that just suddenly happens. It really does have steps, and it can be broken down into, you know, the most basic step, and then going up in complexity and given to kids at exactly the rate they're ready for, so that it doesn't feel overwhelming to them, and it can be joyful and they can feel successful. I think that's something that's so important, is that kids feel successful whenever they're learning, so that they have a love of learning whenever they're doing it.
Yes.
Whenever we have a kid who isn't necessarily dyslexic, they're just learning to read, do you think there's any benefit to them having this as just general reading instruction?
I do, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. In fact, I'm going to try to maybe share a slide. Oh, okay, I didn't let you know. I'm sorry.
If you can't, email it to me and I'll share it.
Okay, I'll email it to you. But yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because what our research actually shows is that all children benefit from the structured literacy approach. In fact, when we're looking at, you know, our national report card, we as a nation only have, we have 64% of our fourth graders that are reading at what's considered the basic or below basic reading level. And so all of our children benefit from this, and that's actually what research shows. However, it's absolutely essential that our struggling readers and our dyslexic readers receive this type of instruction. So the thing is that it doesn't hurt anyone. It's best practices for everybody to receive this kind of instruction, but it's absolutely essential for our struggling kiddos. And it doesn't hurt anyone to have this. Yeah, I get kiddos all the time.
I kind of think of it, what I see, I mean, I've worked across 4 different states inside schools. And what I often think about with reading instruction whenever this is not done is that it would be similar to math if we just said, you know, we just handed them worksheets and said, figure it out. One day you'll know how to add and subtract just on your own naturally. And it's like, no, that doesn't work. I think we have to, even with kids who have no, you know, inherent biological difficulties with reading, we still need to tell them the skills of reading, you know?
Absolutely. And I tell my dyslexic learners all the time, because it's something that is unexpected. They are very intelligent.
Yeah.
They're smart. So this has nothing to do with intelligence. This just has to do with that we need to have instruction taught in a way that makes sense for our brain. And I have one of my older students who came to me, and she wasn't diagnosed until 7th grade, but her mom knew in kindergarten. She was like, there's something wrong. She kept bringing it up year after year, and finally took her to her private testing, and sure enough, she's dyslexic. And so I worked with her, and we really had to work also on self-esteem. But one of the great things about it was, as she was learning this and figuring out what worked best for her brain, and all of a sudden, like, everything was unlocking, she would go to school and she felt so confident that she was helping her other friends who weren't diagnosed as dyslexic. And they're like, how do you know this? And she's like, oh, well, I'm dyslexic, so I totally know how to do all this stuff. Like, she was teaching them all these spelling rules that they had no idea about. And that was just really empowering for her. But it just shows, again, like, all of our kiddos need this instruction in a way that makes sense for them, because our language is actually very reliable. I know people all the time like to say, oh, English is crazy, but it's actually really reliable when you understand it. And so that's what we do, is we help kiddos understand that language.
I think for our age, whenever we were children, we weren't necessarily taught the rules either. So as adults, even though, you know, we're reading, we don't know the rules. So we're like, wait, I don't know why we do this. I just know we do it.
Or like, oh, I just remember it just looks right, right? So a lot of times I'll hear parents say that, well, it just looks right. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like, how many times are we often like saying, does that look right? Does it not look right? Where if you knew the orthographic pattern or the reasoning behind it, it makes it so much easier. And it really unlocks a lot of things, especially when we start working with morphology and we understand that there's these smaller units that carry meaning, and that really opens up a whole world of vocabulary for our kids, which is so important for them.
So I'm glad that you said orthographic. So orthographic, I think I'm going to give the right definition of this. I might mess it up a little bit, but it's like the visual construction of the grapheme. So like what the word looks like with the letters. And so I have a funny story. Whenever I was in graduate school, my advisor studied reading, and my program, well, my advisor was very behaviorist, and so he thought of reading as a behavior. And we would go into these elementary schools and administer a ton of different reading tests. And there was always this one test that had 2 columns, and it just had a string of nonsense letters, and the kids had to choose which one was right. And I remember giving it, I gave it for like a month, and I was like, I have no idea what the right answers are to this. No idea whatsoever. I was like, this is the most baffling test I have ever seen. And it's for like first graders.
Yeah.
And then I finally asked one of the older graduate students, and they were like, oh, this is orthography. You're choosing the letter string that actually occurs in the English language. And I was like, oh, I failed spelling all throughout elementary school. Like, I had no idea whatsoever. Never even occurred to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, go ahead and say.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, and I never do this in my, well, I take that back. I do this, but I want you to tell me a little bit more about it. I want you to kind of educate me on this. So I hear about different types of dyslexia, like orthographic dyslexia versus phonological dyslexia, things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit? And because it's not in the DSM, right? So in my mind, I kind of don't go past that whenever it's more specific to like your profession, and I don't do your profession, so I don't go there. So yeah.
Yeah, that one is still, there are certainly people in my field who talk about that, orthographic and phonological. For me, what that really represents more is when I'm looking at their learning profile and I'm looking at where they had bigger deficits. So for some of our kids, it may have been that it was within the orthographic or the writing system where I'm seeing a lot of their deficits. But even that I can link back to phonological deficit, because if you're having spelling errors, you're not able to link yet the sounds to the appropriate written symbols. So it's still linking back to phonology. And so what we look at is each individual, excuse me, when we think about dyslexia, it's really as unique as a fingerprint. So we have these key characteristics that exist that help us, when we're looking at diagnosing, we fall within these characteristics, but we're still on a continuum. So we might have someone who's really, really blocked and can't decode 3-letter words, or we might have someone who's reading, but when I'm looking at their spelling, it's, they're not yet linking those sounds to print. And so it's really very unique in terms of looking at a learning profile and understanding exactly what particular areas are the largest deficits. And so I think when we're talking about those differences like that, I really think that that's really almost more what they're talking about is that learning profile.
So there's no reason for me then to necessarily put that in a report. I mean, not if they're going to go to someone as expertise as you.
I mean, there might
be someone that
you know, disagree with that. But I when we do reports, we just aren't. It's either dyslexia with, you know, looking at the report and looking at specific deficits. But really, they need to have all of the components covered.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, and that often happens, which I'm very thankful for, because I only have time. I have to cover so many different domains whenever I do a neuropsychological evaluation. I don't have time to go into just the phonological processing of a kid super extensively. So I fully expect that whenever that kid then goes to a tutor, that they're going to get even more testing across so many different areas of basic reading and even reading comprehension, vocabulary, whatever. And I think parents should be aware of that the evaluation that I give is more about diagnosing, but then the incoming evaluation that you guys give and the ongoing evaluation is much more about intervention planning.
Right. And I think that as parents, that's something that you should kind of look at is understand, have someone help walk you through what that testing means and then what that means for recommendations. And I know neuropsychs do a great job of adding in recommendations at the end, but sometimes parents need someone to walk through it. And that's what I do a lot is they'll come in with their testing and I explain to them exactly what it means and what it would look like for instructional purposes. But really, if you go to a tutor or a therapist, like, yeah, they should do some kind of baseline where even we're taking the information from that testing, but then also looking a little bit deeper if it's needed. And then also progress monitoring that is directly related to your instructional like scope and sequence that you're working on.
Okay, so we've now covered what does it look like when a parent calls, what does it look like when you're working with a child. How long, I know this is probably variable, how long do you think you typically end up working with a kid if they come in and, you know, kindergarten, first grade, and they're coming in regularly, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So one of the things to understand is that, you know, we have 26 letters in our language and those language represent sounds. And in the English language, we have 44 sounds that we use and to create words. And within those 26 letters, there's a whole slew of combinations that we use for those 44 sounds. So typically what would happen is that most programs are designed to be a 2-year therapy program in which you introduce and practice those 44 sounds. Now for really young kiddos, they aren't going to get to the more advanced levels where you're working with, you know, Greek and Latin roots and combining forms and things like that. So it really would kind of depend. But if you are going to be looking at covering those 44 sounds, it's usually a 2-year process. But like I said, because we all exist on a continuum, some kiddos may take longer, some may be able to go a little bit quicker. But I also think it's important to note that writing, what I always tell parents is that when we look at how reading and language develop, it's like a triangle, right? And this is the same thing for language acquisition. So we have this receptive language that's coming in where, you know, as a baby, we're learning language and we're hearing sounds and we're processing it. And this works also if you're learning a second language, right? You're able to understand it before you're able to actually speak it back out, right? And so then we have that expressive language, and then we have reading, and then at the top of the triangle is writing, which takes the most cognitive demand because you're actually incorporating all of those other layers as you're doing your writing. So sometimes our kiddos will finish with their therapy, but then may still need some assistance in the area of writing, expressive writing, or even some executive function skills. So it really kind of depends on the kiddo, but typically, you know, you can kind of about 2 years for therapy practice.
So your specialty includes writing and executive functioning, coaching, tutoring. Okay, that's interesting. Whenever I am asked to evaluate for a written language disorder, which some parents will call it dysgraphia, which I find confusing because oftentimes there's either a fine motor coordination disorder, which I think a lot of parents think that is dysgraphia, but dysgraphia, for my understanding, is really that disconnect and that process that you just talked about with being able to do expressive writing. And so I'm kind of just piecing all that apart. But in the readings that I've done, writing isn't actually a skill that we can expect children to be fluent at until their teenage years.
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of my students, and really a lot of the kiddos that I get, I'm starting to get younger children now as we're sort of having, I would almost say, like this wave of understanding. You know, Emily Hamper came out with her hard words, which if you haven't listened to that podcast, it's definitely worth listening to. And she talks about this collective, the science of reading, right? And there's almost like this wave, even though being in education for so long, this isn't new information. In fact, the simple view of reading it came out in 1986. So this isn't new, but I think there's been a disconnect between what neuroscientists and researchers are studying and what's actually being applied in the classroom. And so there's like this disconnect. And right now there's like this big push, and a lot of it's from these grassroots movements from parents as well. It's really pushing to have them be connected more. And that's what I do too. When I work with training teachers and schools, I really work on helping them connect the science and make it applicable in their classrooms so that they understand the how and the why of what it is that we're doing. Because that's really how we can make that systemic change that we need to do in our schools.
Going back to the executive functioning skills, what might be a few of the things that you think are most important for writing that parents can either look for and say, oh gosh, if we got some supports with this would really help my child in class and high school, or just something that they might be overlooking and saying, you know, this isn't even my child's fault. Like, this is a part of maybe ADHD that's now contributing to writing or something like that.
Yeah, and so that writing piece is really challenging. And I do have a lot of my older students that come, and also understanding that there really is a coexisting, you know, we have what's called comorbidity between some of our disorders and disabilities. And so some of my kiddos will have dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD, right? They have the trifecta going on. And so they really need help. When we're looking at dysgraphia, a lot of times it's also just sequencing ideas. And so a lot of times our kiddos will get stuck. And if they have any kind of language stuff going on, they might not even be able to express their thoughts in like a cohesive sequence. And so I help them just do a brain dump, and it will be where we just are talking about it. So I have one of my high schoolers, she's working, their reading assignment for AP English was To Kill a Mockingbird. Well, we had to do a big, huge brain dump before we were able to write our essays for that, right? There's a lot going on. So I think understanding that talking and language is first. So if your kiddos are really stuck and they're having a hard time just organizing their ideas, one of the easiest ways I think for parents and for kids to do is to just do a brain dump. And so what I'll have them do is they're talking and I'm just writing down notes. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll do it in like a web where I'll put the topic in just a circle, and then they just say things and we write this web. And it doesn't have to be in any order, because that's often not how my ADHD kids are thinking. They're not thinking sequentially. They will jump all over in what they're remembering. Right. So that way they're not having to put it in an outline form to start. So we just get all the information out, and then from there, then we can go back and number it and see what makes sense in a sequence. That's really one of the starting places I would go with those kids, because they really get stuck when they are looking at a format that goes from, 1A, 1B, 1, that is, they get stuck. They really have a hard time putting them in sequence. And sequencing things is also hard for our dyslexic learners. So that's also, if you have a dyslexic learner, putting the alphabet in order is really hard. And so when we're trying to do the same thing, we're asking them to do that for writing, it's the same thing. So doing brain dumps is a really great way to do that. And then from there, you can take that information and help them move it around.
Yeah. I love how you just broke apart like what I think many people, many teachers and parents think is the first skill, which is create an outline, right? But no, that can be broken down even further. And I know, especially for myself, and I feel like a lot of kids are this way too, that if that first step is too difficult, I'm going to procrastinate. I have to make it easy enough to do the first step. Yeah. And so I think a lot of times parents think it's a behavior problem potentially when kids aren't getting their work done. And it's really about setting up the task so that it's easy enough to achieve each step in the task. The kid feels successful, and you're able to praise the kid throughout the task for all of their successes. Yeah. Everybody starts to feel good.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I just love this conversation. It's so good. I'm learning a ton.
And for big projects for our kids too, backwards planning is huge. So if they have a big assignment coming up, a lot of times our kids don't understand how long something will actually take. So having them backwards plan and say, okay, this is the due date, and then by this week you need to have this, by this week you need to have that. And so that's a lot of the stuff that I work on with the kiddos too. Again, it's all that organization skill and that executive function piece that comes into play.
Yeah, awesome. Are there ever times where you feel like you want to refer out to a speech language pathologist, PT/OT, psychologist, any like other types of providers? And if so, what might be the conditions that would bring that about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of times when they come to me, they've already had a diagnosis. However, sometimes there might be kiddos who have very unique learning differences, like they might truly have a visual tracking concern. And so, I have an ophthalmologist that would work with that, but also understanding that dyslexia is not visual. So that's not what it wouldn't be for that. It would be truly for a tracking eye issue. But and then for OT, yeah, definitely looking at different things. A lot of kiddos, like you said, for dysgraphia, a lot of people think it's just messy handwriting. It really is beyond that. We do work on the handwriting piece and all that, but if someone is clearly having more than just your traditional struggling with just fine motor and that gross motor piece, and they need more extensive work, then I would refer out to an OT. Or a lot of times what we'll do is we work together, because I think that what we do in dyslexia therapy is very different than what the OT person does, but they actually support one another. And same thing with SLP. So a lot of our kiddos will have both. They'll go to speech path, and then they come to me for more of the language and the reading components that go along with that, where in speech they're focusing on maybe articulation components. So there's a lot of overlap, but I think that having almost like this tribe, this collective of professionals that are each within their own little specialty area to support the kids and work together is really important for our kiddos.
Okay, and then I know we briefly chatted about this before we got started, and I just want to make sure we hit on it, because I think this is a big sticking point for many parents out there, that I want to say probably many times, more than half the times, that by the time a parent is looking for a specialist like yourself, they've tried some of the more basic things like the high school tutor or the local college tutor, things like that, and things haven't worked, and they've maybe thought it was a behavior difficulty with their child, and so maybe they've tried consequence systems. And oftentimes I see that the kid is super frustrated, the parent is super frustrated, and so now we have a little bit of an emotional component going on, maybe with the kid and maybe also with the parents. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that element whenever you first get started with a kid.
Yeah, a lot of times, by the time parents are seeking me out, a lot of times they've reached frustration level themselves, either with the schools or with services that they are or aren't receiving, or feeling maybe that they're not being heard. And so the first thing, my job is to just listen and to be empathetic and really to try to understand their unique situation and where they are on their journey. Sometimes I get parents who maybe just did get a diagnosis of dyslexia and they're completely freaked out and they don't understand what it means. And so helping them understand what it means, that it's going to be okay, that your child is really smart, they just learn in a little bit of a different way, is really helpful. And so I think what we work on is really creating this almost like this family, this team, this support system for the parents. And I work with the parents almost as much as with the kiddos, because it goes hand in hand, right? And so as the parents start to understand dyslexia better, they can speak to it better with their kiddos. And then when the kiddos come to me, a lot of times they're really frustrated themselves. And so oftentimes I have to actually go back and we're unlearning either bad habits that they've formed or coping mechanisms, whether it's behavioral coping mechanisms or academic coping mechanisms, but also unlearning misinformation that they've received. And so there's a lot of unlearning that has to be broken down as we move forward. And so there's the academic piece, but then there's also the social and emotional piece that comes into play, because as we get those older kiddos, especially, they really do know that they are struggling. In fact, first graders know. They look around and they see all my friends are getting this and I'm not. Why am I getting it? I'm dumb. And that's what they think. And it's not that they're dumb. And so the more that we can spread awareness about dyslexia and reading and how we can best help all of our students, we can work on preserving their self-esteem, because it's a lot easier to preserve self-esteem than it is to rebuild it.
Right. For sure. Yeah, I just love that. Okay, so is there anything I haven't asked you that you would just love to share with us about dyslexia?
I'm trying to think if I even covered. I don't know. Let me think about that. Let's see. Well, I think that there's definitely some myths around dyslexia that still exist. I think, like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. People with dyslexia are very smart. In fact, 35% of all American entrepreneurs identify as dyslexic. I think that being in today's day and age, I'm so glad that there are adults that are speaking out about dyslexia, and there's kind of like this big movement about bringing awareness to it. And when we talk about the prevalence too, so when I talk about this with my students, I let them know it's 1 in 5, or 15 to 20% of the population has dyslexia, which means you're not alone, because they feel so alone. And they need to understand that they're not. So if you're a classroom teacher, that means you have kiddos with dyslexia in your classroom.
Yeah.
And they may be on, the mild range, or they might be really severe. Like I said, it exists on that continuum, but you have kiddos sitting in your class. So we all need to have a better understanding of dyslexia. Some of the other things that I hear a lot is, it's they it's visual, right? That they're seeing letters backwards or seeing words backwards. And it really is not visual at all. In fact, we all have to teach our brain to process those letters in the correct way, because that's not how our brains were made, right? They weren't made for this writing and reading system. And so our brains were made to, way back, you know, when we had to watch out for saber-toothed tigers, it didn't matter where it was coming from. It was always a saber-toothed tiger, right? I can move a chair in any direction. It's still a chair. It doesn't matter which way I'm looking at. And that's how our brains work. But then we take these letters and all of a sudden they have to be in a set position. And so it's not even on the test. We don't test for whether they're writing letters backwards. So usually if that exists past 8, then that's just telling me that orthographic processing system is something that we're still working on, that link between the visual and orthographic processing system. So while a lot of times dyslexic kiddos will struggle with B and D or P and Q, those tricky ones, that's not set in stone, and that's not an indicator of dyslexia.
Right.
Let's see, what are some other myths? Are there any other myths that you hear about dyslexia?
I don't know, because I feel like when parents come in, I just kind of explain it to them, and I don't get a ton of parents coming in with the myths, probably because I'm not on the treatment side of it. You know, it's not like anxiety or depression or autism. I don't ever treat dyslexia. So I'm just on the diagnosis side of it. And I do have some personal experiences knowing people with dyslexia. And I remember it was always confounding to me why the parent would constantly make comments about how intelligent her child was whenever it was very clear that her child was intelligent. And I didn't understand why she needed to say that. And it was only later that I realized that there were myths out there. So I guess for me, like not understanding that maybe within the parental community, there are myths out there about that. Just being more on the research side of it. Yeah.
And I think the biggest one, and I think why parents are always like, well, they're really smart, is because they're struggling in school. And so it's, you know, I always remind parents and educators too that, you know, our kids are working so hard to process all of this information. And if we think about how often we ask children to read, or just how much environmental print is around us. We read emails and street signs and grocery lists, and they're constantly surrounded by the thing that's really hard for them. Like that's really hard. And a lot of times it does completely impact their self-esteem. And so I think parents, and myself included, right, we're like, you're smart, you're really smart. And it's really hard for them because they don't feel it, because for 8 hours of their day, they're stuck in an environment that they're not shining, and they're constantly reminded how hard it is, and constantly, a lot of times, feeling like they're not understood, or being asked to do things, or might be made to feel that they shouldn't have accommodations, or that by asking for accommodations, they're being a difficult kid. Or there's a lot of nuances that go into it that I think really play into that self-esteem piece that I see. And I think that that's maybe why a lot of times parents are just like, they're really smart, because we see it when we work with them and you talk to them, but you know, in the classroom setting, and they're not always able to show that. And I think that that's really hard for them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think if I ever do work with these kids, it's always because of more of the social, emotional, and behavioral aspects that are happening in the home, where it's before the parent really understands maybe that aspect of it, and before they've gotten to an expert like yourself where they're getting really good effective treatment for the dyslexia. And so it's more about that exploration and discovery, understanding the child's unique way of learning. And so there is this sense of self-defeat. And so I might be working with the parent to help build their self-confidence, the child's self-confidence, and teaching the parent to use more of a growth mindset type of language with the child. So yeah, and I love doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm gonna pass them off to you.
And the growth mindset and metacognitive skills are definitely something that I weave into my daily practice with my kiddos because it's so important. You know, anytime that you have struggles that come up or obstacles, we want to have a way to approach them in a way that lets us grow. And because if we don't, we're just always going to be stuck, or then we'll fall maybe into more of like the victim mode. And that's not the case. We know what to do. We can do it. We just need to approach it in a way that lets us learn.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, Casey, where can parents find you? Because parents across the US and even the world can work with you through telehealth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then even teachers who might want to do some sort of consultation with you can actually work with you too.
Yes, and I train teachers as well, and helping them. I really think that there is, you know, so like there's people like me that want to do the whole therapy route, but I really believe firmly in I would love to work myself out of a job. And what I mean by that is if we can get our core instruction to be really solid and we're meeting the needs of all of our kiddos in the classroom, then that leaves this much smaller percentage that really needs that intense therapy model. So if we can, you know, get that core reading down, I think that that's what I just want for everybody, because reading means freedom. I mean, there's so much research behind what happens if we are illiterate, and there's all the links to prison and to high school dropouts and all of these things. It is so important for us to have these conversations and to really start to look at what we're doing in the classroom so that we can build up that literacy for all of our kiddos, because it's what we need and it's what links to freedom.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so where can people find you?
I can go on forever. Okay. You can find me at Wimberley Dyslexia Center. .com, or also the dyslexiaclassroom.com.
Awesome.
Either of those places, either on social media or website. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I will link to those links in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for being here. This was such an awesome interview. So awesome. I know I've learned a lot, and I think that this conversation is going to be so relevant to so many parents, teachers, and providers out there. Thank you so much for doing this. And then everybody out there, I've mentioned the past few weeks that I am setting a goal to grow my email list. I want to reach 1,000 subscribers in September. So please share this video with your friends, your family, your child's teacher, your child's provider, whoever you think might find it interesting. I think a lot of people are going to find this super helpful. I have more experts coming in the next several weeks about a variety of topics, and it's all free. This is great information, right? Can you believe that this is all free? It's amazing. So share it and sign up for the email list. You can do that at enildaclinic.com. All right, everybody, I will see you next time. Bye.